living a full and well life.
This is put together.
Grow. Authentic.
We feel it.
Take care of ourselves.
Hello, and welcome back to the Wishing You Well podcast, where we help you navigate your wellness journey each and every week. I'm Amy Albero.
And I'm Catherine Van Eyck. We're both licensed therapists, simplifying all things wellness on Wishing You Well. And today we're welcoming back Arielle Kempler to continue our discussion about trauma. As I said in the previous episode, if you did listen to our part 1 trauma, this could potentially be more of an intense episode or just not as light as our typical Wishing You Well content. We're switching gears though and talking about therapy techniques, specifically EMDR as it pertains to trauma. So I'm not even going to kind of talk about what that is because I'm going to let Arielle tell us all about it in a moment.
Yes. Yeah. So we have another very packed episode with Arielle. But that's not going to stop us from still checking in with one another to see how we're doing, what our self-care is looking like. So Arielle, welcome back. Happy to have you. What is on your self-care menu today or this week?
This week is cold, but I am making it really intentional just to be outside. There's something about the fresh air that there's something about the fresh air that helps, but something about the cold fresh air that has been feeling, as sad as I am that it's cold, refreshing. So I have made it a point to every day just walk outside and just feel the warmth of the sun on my face, feel the coldness that is there, maybe embracing the sweater a little bit longer, but really just loving the sunshine, loving just being outside and remembering that there is an outside world, even when I'm super busy. So that's been the capacity of my self-care right now.
It can be a challenge to force yourself to do that when it's maybe not as pleasant as when the weather's nice, and it's easier to just say oh yeah, obviously I'm going to go outside and do this because it's nice outside, but you can benefit even when it's chilly.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I like the reframe around the cold air and the sweater, which is nice because while it is the end of March and we could be, a little sour about the fact that spring has not totally sprung yet, you're still embracing the weather as it is. You're in acceptance mode.
Yes. And it makes it so that I don't have to switch over my closet right now.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I hear you, end of March. I meet you there. I'm embracing the sweater. Next week, you could be a little bit warmer though.
Well, hopefully when this episode comes out in April sometime, people
Mm-hmm.
are kind of in that mode of
yeah,
to be cold again.
Yes.
Catherine, how about you?
So it's funny you said it's harder to make those kinds of plans when it's yucky out or cold. I feel like I've been making a lot of plans, and I think it's in part due to how much of a weird time of life this seems like, and still feeling like a new mom and not having a lot of mom friends and trying to make mom friends, but then also trying to keep up with my other friends and doing all of that. So I've just been making a lot of plans. I've texted, maybe even just this morning, I feel like I made a lot of plans for this weekend and next weekend, and maybe even the weekend after that, because it's also Easter's coming up. So I know there's a lot of family time coming up, and that's my self-care, is going to be talking to people that say more than yeah or so.
Oh, the squeaking. We are at a squeaking phase too. This constant all day, all night.
No, and don't get me wrong, I love it. It's just, want some variety in there.
Variety of syllables.
Variety of conversation other than do you have to poop?
I'm assuming you don't ask that to your friends.
Yeah.
Rarely. How about you, Amy? How are you feeling? How's your self-care?
Yeah, it's definitely a busier time. Hopefully that will kind of ease a little bit in the next couple of months. But I do have a very big self-care treat coming up. I'm going on vacation for like almost 2 weeks, which is really nice. And I plan to completely unplug. I think I might have shared it on this podcast, but like I have an old iPhone that I bring, and all that's on it is my podcast apps, like any music apps, Kindle, Audible. That's it. Like no social media, no email. Like my calls are disabled, like Wi-Fi calling. So I plan to fully unplug. But the other thing that I wanted to highlight in terms of that is my husband and I have gotten into a really good habit of like prior to a vacation, we're having a conversation around like, okay, what do you need and want to get out of this vacation, and vice versa. And so like we've like been having those conversations about like what we each want and need so that we can like kind of hold each other accountable to that. And for me, it's doing as little as possible and just like having it be a purely relaxing vacation. And this is actually the first time maybe in our relationship history that he's on the same page and wants to do as little as possible, which I'm seeing both of your faces. Arielle, despite being new to Revive, you already know that that's very, very out of character for Chris. So I think we're both like in a season of life where we feel like life is lifing and we need a little bit of a break. So I think we're both going to support each other in getting that. So that's going to be my self-care. And I'm really looking forward to that.
So nice. I'm glad he's on the same page with you.
Thank goodness.
You were getting what you want.
Yeah, sometimes I'm there in my beach chair and he's like working away, and it can be hard to relax when someone is around you is like always working. So, well, let's hope it continues that way. But I'll report back anyway. I just want to take a quick pause to tell you that Revive is hiring. In our Miami and Pittsburgh offices, we have full and part-time W-2 and 1099 clinician positions available, and this includes both postgraduate and associate level licenses, in addition to fully licensed clinicians. In our Connecticut offices, we have full-time, fully licensed W-2 clinician positions available, including clinical supervisor opportunities. If you are interested in working for a company that values community, work-life balance, and your personal and professional growth, then we want to meet you. Find a link to our website in our bio. So we are back this week for part 2 of our trauma series. And as you know, Arielle is back with us. And we did an overview in our first episode about trauma, really defining what trauma is. And we started to dip our toes a little bit into trauma treatment and what trauma therapy is. And so we're going to get more into that today for sure. But just in case our listeners have forgotten, or maybe they skipped part 1, Arielle, can you just briefly reintroduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Arielle Kempler, and I am a therapist at Revive, and I am a trauma therapist. And I labeled myself as a trauma therapist as that is where a bulk of my training comes from. It doesn't mean that I only work with trauma. It's just every time I meet with a client, I do have a trauma lens to my work. And also in that I am specifically trained in trauma therapy. So I have a certificate in integrative trauma therapy, and I am trained in 2 different modalities of trauma therapy, one being EMDR, which I've been trained in for almost 10 years and been doing for almost 10 years, and sensory motor psychotherapy. Both very different, both have the same goal. So that's really how I approach a lot of my therapy sessions, through a trauma lens, and working through this idea of feeling safe and creating a safe place in our bodies.
Thank you for that. And I know that you are referencing specific types of therapies that help to support, address, treat trauma. Can you maybe define or demystify what those letters mean in EMDR and kind of what that might look like?
Yes. So I It's interesting how much EMDR, I would say in the past couple of years, has really blown up. And there's not a ton of knowledge around what EMDR is. And I think part of that is because I think it was maybe on a TV show. Someone told me it was on a TV show. So I think that that's where people are getting their information from. And I think partly because trauma is just becoming more forefront. But let me start off with just saying what the letters stand for, which actually will be a bunch of nonsense. But I will tell you what it is, because I know there's a curiosity there. So EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So a lot of therapeutic fancy terms. So I'll kind of put it in layman's terms, in that this is a trauma therapy that uses bilateral stimulation, which is connecting the right brain, left side of the body, left side of the body, to process trauma, to make the disturbance that someone feels when experiencing the trauma lessen, in hopes to create a safe enough place within oneself, and to lessen the disturbance that they feel when they're activated. So again, it's using eye movement, or actually just bilateral stimulation in general, which could be eye movement. It could be tapping sides of your body like this. There is this fancy light bar that some people have, in which you move your eyes that way. Sometimes the therapist actually just moves their hand this way, back and forth. Or actually, what I use are called tappers, and they're little things that you could put in your hands that vibrate at different speeds. Again, connecting right brain and left brain, connecting right side of the body to the left side of the body, in a way so that you can remain present while also processing trauma.
So why is it, I mean, other than it being in a TV show, like why are people so down with EMDR? Like, why is it such a sought after treatment for trauma?
I think that there's a couple of reasons why EMDR is so popular. One of it is really, in true honesty, it can actually the treatment tends to be a shorter treatment than something like talk therapy, which has a longer arc, and could kind of feel like open-ended. EMDR is very much a process. So there is a beginning, middle, and an end, and there's a process to it, and can be quite quick depending on the trauma, and what's coming up. So I think that's part of it. Another part of it is it's not talk therapy. So you're not coming into a session and having to narrate or go through verbally the whole trauma. You don't have to dig it up. You don't have to say every feeling, every thought, every detail of it. In fact, there's not a lot of talking in general when it comes to EMDR. It is not talk therapy. It is experiential. So it is really about the process and the bilateral stimulation, and not about the talking and the analyzing. So I think some people are drawn to that because they're like, I've been through it. I've told a million people it. Like, I just don't want to have this activation anymore. And then again, I do think that there is something kind of mystifying about it. In true honesty, like, there's a lot of research of why it may work, but there's not this is why it works. There is this connection to right brain, left brain connection, the bilateral stimulation, the idea of being present, and also being able to process that all those are scientifically based and neurobiology based, but there's not necessarily like a hard, fast, this is why it works. And I think that there is a little bit of a draw because of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I have to say, as a fellow trauma therapist, trained differently, of course, when EMDR was rising in its popularity over the last what feels like handful of years, do you think that's fair?
Yeah.
I kind of felt a little anxious about it. Like, oh my gosh, like letting me in someone's brain that way, like that feels so scary. And so not that I was skeptical of it, but it just felt like, what's going on in there? Like, and so I think I felt a little resistance to it at the time, but as I've grown to learn more about it, I feel like more just like comfortable with the concept of it. But initially for me, the mystification was what felt a little like scary.
Yeah. I will say that me too. And I remember, so when you go through EMDR training, it's very extensive. So another thing that I really want to also note is that not anyone can just do EMDR. So if you're seeing a therapist and they're not trained in the EMDR, they can't do EMDR. And that is because it is a very specific process that you have to be trained in and you have to understand. And there's a lot of things that you have to be aware of when you do it. And part of the training is actually like getting EMDR done to you. And I think that for me, that was the selling point because I'm here being like, this sounds all, magical and wonderful and whatever, but like, does it really work? Like, I don't know. And I don't have that big of a trauma. So like, I don't know how this is going to work. And you see it happen and you experience it and you're like, okay, like now I get it. So I had the same thing, Amy. I was like, this sounds a little too, too much, and seems like a little bit of a false promise. Like, oh, I'm going to fix this, and again, like I for those of you who listened last time, trauma therapy is not about fixing the trauma. You can't go back and make it not a trauma. It is about the present and the things that you're experiencing now. It's lessening the disturbance that you feel now, not that you felt then. And I think that is such an important aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I know in the first episode, I was talking a bit about my experience with trauma training and being trained in trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy. And the same is true in that sense too. It is the type of trauma therapy where we are doing a lot of talking about it and are talking about all the details and the thoughts and the feelings, but specifically it's really about addressing, as you share, that memory with me, how are you feeling about it now? And the goal of TFCBT and the repetition around processing a narrative is to decrease essentially the number. Like if you're rating it at a 10 as most upsetting, the goal is to decrease the intensity of the emotion now as you think about and remember the experience. And so yeah, there's no, like, regardless of all these great evidence-based trauma treatments, there's no such thing as waving our magic wands and making this just not happen. And so it's all about changing our tolerance, as you had talked about a bunch in part one of this, increasing our window of tolerance and our ability to stay in our window of tolerance around distress.
Yeah. Absolutely. And something that you had mentioned with TFCBT is also very true in EMDR. And something that you'll find if you are like exploring trauma therapies is all trauma therapy has the same goal, and it usually has very similar language. And I didn't realize this until I was trained in sensory motor, that it's all the same, the same kind of language. It's just different approaches to it. Mm-hmm. And what you were describing is what we call in EMDR as the SUDS, which is the subjective unit of disturbance. And that's so that the goal of EMDR is to make your SUDS level, so how disturbing something feels right now, lower. And that's how you know it's working. And that's what I also love about EMDR is that every session you are checking that SUDS level. So you can feel like, okay, yeah, I don't feel no disturbance, but at the beginning of the session, I was at a 10 and now I'm like at a 9.5, right? So you see a little bit of a difference. And that I think is another really wonderful part of EMDR and in trauma therapy in general is that it's not about eradicating, it's about seeing a change.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Full disclosure, and obviously, I mean, you guys both know, I'm not trained in EMDR. I'm not trained in either one of these trauma therapies. But I've had a lot of clients that are really interested in EMDR specifically. And at the same time, they're really hesitant about it because it just also screams like you will be working on your trauma. Whereas somebody can go into their talk therapy and almost like brush on the fact that they've been through trauma, but not actually get to the root of it. And your therapist might not go there with you just because you might not be ready to go there. Mm-hmm. So what might be some sort of way to bridge that hesitancy for somebody to open up themselves to going to EMDR? Similar to, somebody might really, really want to lose a ton of weight and not want to work with a nutritionist, but like want to work with a nutritionist. Mm-hmm. So like, how do you get that person from curious and hesitant and scared to walk through your door?
So I think a really important thing to note is when you meet with a EMDR therapist, you're not doing EMDR, you're not doing the bilateral stimulation the minute you get into the session. And I think that that is a comforting thing for some people. And I think that is a frustrating thing for some people. And that is because as an EMDR therapist and doing EMDR, you have to be sure that the person who's going to do this really hard process, it has the resources that they need, that if this feels too hard, that they can go back on. There needs to be a therapeutic relationship between you and your therapist, as you need with a therapist not doing EMDR. So if you look at the stages of EMDR, the first two stages of EMDR are not processing. You're not doing the actual bilateral stimulation. The first two processes, which can last 6 weeks even, stage of the process is one, like building rapport with your therapist, and two, creating a space in which you can feel ready to go to that part. So that when you're ready to do the processing aspect of EMDR, you have a foundation of feeling safe. You know how to take care of yourself. You know when you're reaching your limit. You know when you're not in a space where you could do it. You know how to bring yourself back. You know how to keep your emotions contained. And so a lot of EMDR work is at that forefront, because once you do that, then you can feel, then once you feel safe enough, then you know you're ready to do the processing part. And that's something that you discuss with your therapist. And I caution you to not jump and rush through that part, because you're going to need that part for when the processing happens.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, and again, sorry to keep bringing it back to TFCBT, but I think the more that we talk about this, Arielle, the more the overlaps are so there, because with TFCBT too, like the setup period is so integral, and it's the first phase is helping someone learn grounding techniques and learn ways to manage and regulate their emotions, and learn, when what it might look like when things get too intense, and what you together are going to do when that happens. Like, there is such a foundation that needs to be built before you get into the process. And I found that can be reassuring. But I wonder, Catherine, another thing that you might be asking, and Arielle, I'm curious your answer for this, is how to know when someone is ready for EMDR. Like, if they're a client who's like thinking about it, or maybe a therapist is listening and has a client that they might think like could benefit from this, like are there any like indicators or like prerequisites or things that someone should be thinking about or looking out for when they're considering seeking EMDR treatment?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that you had said in terms of what we talked about in terms of being able to have the ability to ground yourself, to feel safe enough, right? So we don't want to do trauma therapy, EMDR, especially when we are not currently in a safe place, right? So if you are continuing, you're experiencing the trauma currently, EMDR is not going to necessarily, one, be effective, but to be safe to do, because the whole idea of trauma therapy is telling your body that you are safe, because you are, right? You're in a therapy room, you're past the trauma. If you are going through the trauma currently, you're not safe enough. Like, there's nothing that we can do, and it can feel really activating. Something else I'll bring up that is just something interesting to note, and maybe it's not very relevant, but something that I found interesting, is that I worked in sexual assault and domestic violence. And we, as a sexual assault therapist and advocate, sometimes wouldn't necessarily even do EMDR with someone who was in the court process, for a couple of reasons. Is that EMDR does, hopefully, if successful, like take away that activation, or not take away, but lessen that activation, and can help you. The last word is desensitization, right? So it's to desensitize you to that. So to make it not so that you look at the trauma and say like, oh, it's not a big deal. It's, I don't have to relive it and be in it and whatever. And sometimes that reliving and being in it serves a purpose, especially if you have to testify in court. And so it's like a very interesting thing, but also, again, you're not in a safe enough place. So I think the most important prerequisite is like being sure that you can feel safe enough. If you are actively going, like if you're actively going through, psychosis, or I mean, that's extreme, but if you are not safe enough, EMDR is going to feel not safe, and that we don't want that. but something that like comes up with a lot of clients before they do EMDR is this feeling of being stuck. Right. A lot of times the clients who come to me who are ready for EMDR are saying, listen, like I know I went through a trauma. I have tried to do all the grounding exercises. I've done some talk therapy or whatever, and I'm feeling really stuck. I feel like I can't get past it. And usually that's like an indicator to me, okay, I think that you're ready for this, right? Like this may be a good avenue. It's a really good unsticking therapy. So I would say too, if you're feeling stuck, you've been through, a trauma, you're feeling stuck, you feel like you can't get past it, you feel like you are noticing patterns in your behavior, right? So hypervigilance, negative thought patterns, things like that. Like EMDR may be a really great way to address those things. And not that you have to go through talk therapy. I don't believe that you have to, but it's a great way to kind of, it's an alternative to that.
Mm-hmm. One question that's come up, I feel like I have a couple of kind of maybe one-off questions for you, but maybe they'll flow into the rest of it. But one question that's come up, and Catherine, I'm thinking about a case of yours that you and I had talked about a couple of years ago, where a client, has been interested maybe in EMDR, but doesn't really have a specific memory that they can tie to. Like, do you need a specific thing to target? Like what do you kind of need to bring into EMDR?
I think also, Amy, if possible, like I think what would maybe be important is to talk about what EMDR looks like, what an EMDR session looks like.
Yeah.
Because when we talk about targeting, it may
yes,
be
right, fair.
So typically in a typical EMDR session, and I want to say typical, and that not all EMDR sessions are typical, and not all EMDR sessions look the same, but it's this idea that you bring in a memory or and when we talk about a memory, it doesn't have to be like this big thing, but you have to bring in something that evokes an emotion, evokes a negative cognition. And so typically what it is it's a part of a memory that's very disturbing, right? So and I also want to talk about that what my example may feel triggering to whoever's listening. And I want anyone who's listening who feels maybe a little bit triggered to take care of themselves while listening to this. But let's say the client brings in a car accident as they were in a car accident. What we do in EMDR is we target a part of that car accident, which is a big thing that multiple things could have happened. We target a specific part that feels maybe most disturbing to them. So maybe it was right before they hit something, like that moment right before where they know that something's going to happen. They don't have the control. They're bracing themselves for impact. It's targeting that specific part. And from there, your therapist will take you through a series of questions. And the most important part of those series of questions is we're looking for a negative cognition. And a negative cognition is a belief that you hold about yourself in that is based off of that moment. Because when bad things happen, we form negative beliefs that almost are there to protect us, right? It's this belief, and it's usually a belief that we had more control than we did. And so sometimes it's, I'm a bad person, or I do things that make people, I'm a bad person. I am broken. I am not in control. These kind of negative cognitions what ends up happening is it ends up coming up in a lot of ways in our lives that connects to a lot of things. And so this negative cognition is how we feel right now about the incident. And it's usually what it forms right after the incident that happens. So we pick this negative cognition, we identify feelings that are coming up. And then the next thing we do is we pick what we would want to believe about ourselves, right? So if it's like, I have no control over what happens to me, like what you want to believe is that like I am in control of my life, right? And we pick that, and throughout it we're measuring how disturbing, how true, all of that. Once we have all those questions and that target memory, we then go into what's called bilateral stimulation, which again is a series of eye movements, taps, using tappers, and your therapist will go through different cycles. So you'll go through a period of tapping. It could be 30 seconds, it could be less, it could be more. You are left to just whatever happens, whatever comes up. And typically what ends up happening is you end up having maybe images of what happened, maybe feelings that are coming up. It may feel really intense, whatever it is. And we go through these series of bilateral stimulation in the hopes that what will end up happening is your brain will start catching up to this feeling that you are safe, and your body will start catching up to this feeling that you are safe, so that when you're done with the bilateral stimulation, you feel like the incident that happened is less disturbing, that negative cognition is less present, and that instead you're feeling more in control. So that's in a very like Cliff Notes version what EMDR looks like. Now, you can work on a target for 3 sessions, for 1 session, for 3 weeks, for 4 weeks, or a month, for however long. It is really up to you and your therapist and where you're at. But typically you work on one target and move on to the next if there are more. So now I forget what your question is.
Well, sorry, just one. So when you're saying work on one target and then move to the next, like in your car accident example,
yeah,
is that the next target within the car accident, or like next target about maybe something else traumatic, or does it not necessarily matter?
I think it really depends. It depends on what you're feeling. It is up to the client. It is not up to the therapist.
Mm-hmm.
So within one incident, there could be multiple things that come up, multiple beliefs around it, because there's different things that are happening. Or sometimes during processing, I've found that it jumps to something else, maybe jumps to a childhood memory, maybe jumps to something that you're afraid of in the future, maybe, so there's different ways and different avenues that you can go through.
Yeah. That actually was I guess the question underneath my question, just again, given my own experience of, maybe someone is coming in to talk about, X, and in talking about X, they're realizing it's really a little bit more about Y, like maybe, a more deeply rooted childhood experience. And so the focus might change. And I guess I was wondering, because I know that, right, and it sounds like there are some like more strict protocols with EMDR, and I didn't know how much flexibility there was to kind of maybe shift the focus or shift the target. But it sounds like wherever the client needs to go is where the therapist will follow.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the times it goes to something else, right? So what we're doing is we're not evoking what makes an incident disturbing or traumatizing is not necessarily the actual incident, it's our body's reaction to it. It's that negative cognition. If that negative cognition wasn't there, it wouldn't feel as disturbing right now. So what we're actually doing in EMDR is we're not changing what happened to us. We can't change what happened to us. What we can change is how we feel about ourselves and the control that maybe we didn't have, and we're reinstilling that power back into ourselves.
Pretty amazing. How do you know if it's working, or how do you know if it's not working?
So a couple of things. We have the SUDS, which is what we described, that level of disturbance, that is kind of that tracker for us, right? That's going to be an indicator very clearly if it's working, if it's moving, if it's not. The thing that I want to caution is that there are times where you'll do an EMDR session and the disturbance level won't change. And it doesn't mean that it's not working. It just means that you have to go through it, maybe you had a great session. It just didn't change because it's really, it's sticky, right? So I think you'll know if it's working, maybe not right away, but over time. That's why we have the level of disturbance. And sometimes if we notice that the SUDS isn't going down, the therapist has all these different techniques to help it go down. So if one avenue is not working, maybe it's about tweaking the target. Maybe it's about tweaking the cognition. Maybe it's about, shifting point of view. Maybe we have to go back to grounding and resourcing and all of that before we can go back to the target. There's a bunch of different things that could get in the way, right? Or like sometimes what's happened is I've been doing EMDR with a client, and then something really disturbing happens in the present time that we just have to take a pause and address that, right? So I think with EMDR, with any therapy, right, you can't. It's subjective. It's based on what you feel. It's not, I can't tell you if it's working. I can't tell you if your disturbance level is going down. It's up to you. And that one thing I'll say with when you're doing EMDR as a client is being as honest as you can with your therapist and saying like, this isn't, I'm not feeling this, or I'm feeling stuck, or this is not feeling good. With that information, the therapist can really help tweak it to see if we can figure out what's getting in the way.
I feel like you kind of answered this when you talked about like how you kind of got bought into EMDR through your experience when you had to actually have it get done to you. And you did say like, I don't think my trauma is big enough. So is there like any trauma too small to have an EMDR?
I think this goes back to the discussion kind of that we had in the last podcast for those who listen, like trauma to an extent is subjective, right? If you are disturbed by something that has happened, if you have disturbing feelings, then it's there. It's your experience. What I will say in my experience as an EMDR therapist, and I want to again be very clear that this is my experience as an EMDR therapist, that I am an EMDR therapist. I'm not necessarily the expert on EMDR, but in my experience, single incident trauma, meaning something that's happened once, that's kind of a single, like not attached to any other events, tends to feel a little bit easier to do with EMDR. There's a clear beginning, middle, and an end. Whereas complex trauma can feel a little bit more difficult to kind of process and suss through. That being said, is that it's not that it won't work, and it does work on that. It's just sometimes in my experience, a single incident trauma has just been a little bit, which makes sense because it's not complex, like a little bit easier to work through. Yeah. But that's been my experience.
Yeah. The only question that's on the tip of my tongue that I feel like you've already answered is like, are there any reasons to not do it?
Yeah. And I also want to, I think, especially recently, EMDR has been looked at as the cure-all, that like, oh, it works so well, it's magic. And I think what happens is that we almost get unrealistic expectations with it. And sometimes like it's just not something that feels good for a client. I am a person who I like the connection of talking to other people. I like being able to be in my body. I like being able to, process outwardly and verbally. And like EMDR is not something that I seek in therapy because it's not something that, like, for me, even though I went through it and I saw that it can work, it didn't feel like it aligned with what I needed. And so I think that I want to caution on that, although I've seen EMDR work amazingly well. And sometimes like I've had sessions where at the end, me and the client are like, that was magic. Like that was amazing. I've had other times where I've worked with EMDR with a client and we've just said, you know what, this isn't what's right for you. And that's okay. Like, let's figure out something else. There are different modalities to trauma therapy, to any therapy, because there are different people. There's not one therapy that's a cure-all. And I want to be very clear on that because I do think EMDR gets this really high rep that like it is a magical cure-all to everything, and it's not necessarily. And it's okay if it doesn't feel good for you. And it's okay if it's not what works for you. And, I've had to work with clients and say, you know what, I think that this may not be what works for you. Let's try something else.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think that's so important, not only about the expectations, but just like all things, right? Like it's all about goodness of fit and like it needs to be the right fit, whether it's therapist or treatment modality. And that is so individualized. And so just because a particular treatment doesn't necessarily quote unquote work for you or feel like it's a good fit for you doesn't mean that you are less likely to be helped or supported. It's just about kind of listening to that and trying to try something different to be more helped and supported. So I think that's one of the things that I found with my clients is like, if a particular approach isn't working, it's like, oh my gosh, like, am I just too far gone? Or like, am I going to have to live like this forever? Like it can feel like this, such an overwhelming sense of dread or guilt or shame around like some part of the therapy not feeling like it's effective. And it's not you that's broken. It's just that the therapy is not the right fit. And so it's important to really pay attention to that and talk to your therapist about it, as you said.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's so important. Something I'm gonna shift a little bit because something I think is it's also important to know is that EMDR can also be treated separate from your regular therapy. So if you're seeing a therapist right now that's not an EMDR therapist, but you want to like dabble in EMDR, you want to experience it, I see a lot of clients that see a therapist that you get that talk therapy from, right? You get to work on maybe things that are happening right now from, and then you do the EMDR with a separate therapist, and it because of it being just such a different kind of therapy. So there's also there's that option too that I just want to put out there.
Well, as we're wrapping up, Arielle, are there any other last things that you want to make sure our listeners know? Again, this is like another tip of the iceberg conversation about trauma treatment, but anything that we didn't talk about, or maybe something that you just want to restate before we close out for today?
Just like if you take away anything from talking about trauma, is that like if any of this is resonating with you, like listen to your body, listen to what your needs are, right? Just because you may not have experienced what we like talked about, this big T trauma, does not mean that you are not worthy of or you don't deserve to feel better. And talk to your therapist or find a therapist to talk to you about your trauma. I think that is something that I want to stress. EMDR is a amazing therapy. Not everyone is trained in EMDR. So also if you are looking to go into EMDR, making sure that the person that you are seeing is trained, actually has that training experience. And that you meet with them and talk to them first, see if it fits with you first. And know that there are other forms of therapy out there. And if you are feeling triggered by this conversation and you want to talk more about it, like reach out to us, reach out to, to Amy, reach out to the podcast, reach out to Revive. We're here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, thank you. And we'll be sure to put resources and just more information about EMDR in our show notes for sure. But as I said in our previous episode, and Catherine and I keep reiterating, this is such a big topic and a topic that affects everybody. And so we want to continue talking about this, but would love to hear from you all. What other questions you have, things about trauma or trauma treatment that you might want to know more about. So you can send us your questions to wishingyouvell@revivecfw.com. You can also DM us and or follow us on Instagram @revivecfw. Catherine is locked in there checking our DMs. So we're looking out for you over there too. You can also check out our website, revivecfw.com. You can follow Catherine @Catherine Van Eyck, me @Amy Albero, LCSW. And we will be back next week with another episode. Until then, we are wishing you well.